That's what I want to hear. That's a great story there. Hello and welcome to episode 31 of Great Things with Great Tech, the podcast highlighting companies doing great things with great technology. My name's Anthony Spiteri, and in this episode, we're talking to the company that is synonymous with CloudStack, the largest independent integrator of CloudStack technologies globally, and a specialist in the design and implementation of infrastructure as a service cloud infrastructure for both private and public cloud implementations. That company is ShapeBlue. I'm talking to Giles Sirett, CEO of ShapeBlue. Welcome to the show, Giles.
Thank you, Anthony. How are you doing?
Excellent. Very well, thank you. So, look, just before we dig into the service provider world and control panels and open and cloud stacks, some of my favorite subjects, if you like great things with great tech and would like to feature in future episodes, you can click on the link in the show notes or go to launch.gtwgt.com and register your interest. And just as a reminder, like always, all previous episodes are available on the YouTube channel. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please click on the button below. And Great Things with Great Tech is also on all good podcasting platforms, Google, Apple, Spotify, all hosted and delivered via anchor.fm. So with that, Giles, let's talk about ShapeBlue and let's talk about CloudStack. And there's a couple of CloudStack and OpenStack jokes I'm sure to be had during the next 20 to 25 minutes. But why don't we start, back in 2011, 2012 and give a bit of a background to yourself and how you started ShapeBlue.
Yeah, sure, Anthony. And by the way, I did write some of those jokes, I think, at the time, but that's another story. So ShapeBlue, so going back even just before that, 2010, I'd been running for a number of years quite a successful managed service provider over here in the UK. We focus on professional services, finance, and the defence sectors. And we've been looking for some time in terms of how we had quite a significant data center presence. We've been looking at how we could save man hours with that data center presence because it was becoming an increasing cost. And we discovered this sort of new concept that has been called at the time data center automation. This sort of comes full circle, I'll explain this later, but one of the technologies we found at the time was called CloudStack, which wasn't even called CloudStack at the time, it was called VMOps. Anyway, I exited that business end of 2010. And we'd done quite a lot of implementing of quite a lot of these automation technologies, which in the meantime had been rebranded cloud technologies. What was data center automation became infrastructure as a service, because basically what it was about doing is automating the network storage and compute and presenting it as a common API. And it wasn't a massive leap for organizations who were looking to copy what, say, Amazon were doing at the time or mirror what they were doing to basically lift those sort of technologies and turn that into a public cloud service. So I spent about 6 months in the wilderness kicking around and quickly established myself as a sort of the go-to guy for a number of service providers because I knew about this stuff and we've been ahead of the curve. So I started consulting and doing sort of non-exec stuff in a number of organizations, helping them with their data center automation and delivery of cloud services. And what I saw is, these were really technical organizations who had spent years worrying about availability for their customers, worrying about, all of the traditional IT challenges, but they were struggling to get their head around, this new model of computing, right? Whether that was from a business perspective or whether that was from a pure IT perspective, things like thinking about horizontal scale instead of vertical scale, right? It's almost like a lot of these organizations needed to be deprogrammed on the way they've been thinking for 10 years. And that's where I hit on the idea of ShapeBlue. I saw a sort of gap in the market for effectively a boutique SI, which is what we were initially, to work predominantly with service providers, helping them envision and design IaaS environments for them to then take to market. And I pulled a team together. We put a proposition out in the market. Sat there for a few weeks waiting for the phone to ring, literally sort of looking at the phone. And then within a few weeks, we started getting calls of people saying, oh, okay, we didn't really know anybody was doing this yet because we've been facing these challenges. And the rest is sort of history. We won some pretty major contracts quite quickly. We became known as the sort of specialists in IaaS. What then did happen, which was quite a big significant change for us, was about 18 months, 2 years later, we looked at our project board one day, and we'd been technology agnostic. We were in the sort of consulting, the SI space. We were pulling technologies together. And we looked at our project board one day, and it basically was littered with CloudStack, right? Everything we were working on was CloudStack. And over time, we just got drawn more and more to this technology.
Right.
And where we are today, as you said in your intro, we are specialists in Apache CloudStack. So we provide effectively the vendor wrapper in terms of engineering services, in terms of support services, training, consulting around what is an open source technology.
Yeah, good stuff. And let's step back a little to that sort of period of time in 2010, because myself, I was kind of undertaking that journey as well, working for service providers, trying to look for this. And I remember the big thing that we were looking for, it wasn't so much automation at the time. It was more about the console. And I've spoken about this on previous episodes, right? The big thing we were trying to get converting and giving our tenants some power was the ability to basically log into a VM console. And that was basically what I'd been tasked with. Let's look at the technologies out there that basically allow us to deliver a console and some sort of controls that allow our tenants to stop, start, provision, configure networking, add storage to VMs. Okay, that's what we were basically wanting. And even back then, it wasn't so much about trying to sort of match Amazon and what they were doing and this whole concept of this end-to-end automation. It was more about how do we put something on top of our VMware stack, our Hyper-V stack, or even our Citrix stack to basically control that and make our jobs as administrators a lot more easier. And that's kind of the basis for these cloud management platforms, and where you saw things like, it was cloud.com, wasn't it, where CloudStack was born. At the same time, VMware vCloud Director started off, and obviously those that know me know that's the path that I took. But there were a ton of other ones that I remember testing, and CloudStack was one of those ones that I remember testing, going, it did the console really well, and I liked that about it, And it was an interesting time, right? Maybe just chat a little bit about those early days, because I think it was such a pivotal moment for infrastructure as service, and really without these sorts of technologies like CloudStack, OpenStack as well, it was kind of not really the same thing, but at the same time, there was a ton of other options that were out there. They drove and fueled the next 10 years for this infrastructure as a service.
Yeah, that's right. And going back to those times you're talking about, sort of 2011, 2012, there was a gold rush going on in our industry, right? So, I'd run a medium-sized service provider. We were looking at opportunities around how we could deliver cloud, but we also saw this as the biggest threat to our business that we'd seen in years. And everybody, and the hyperscalers hadn't quite got the dominance they've got now. And again, people were seeing that as a threat. So nobody quite knew where their level was in this new world order, right? And there was an absolute rush to get technology to match that requirement and match that demand, which is ultimately about being able to, like you say, take a whole load of infrastructure, put a API, a UI, a GUI or some sort of CLI on the front of it, and let people access it.
Yeah.
And I think, all of the things you mentioned there, I mean, you've mentioned, vCloud Director, obviously talking about CloudStack today, you mentioned OpenStack. They all were working initially to that same idea, right? That same loose idea that we've got this infrastructure, we need to orchestrate it, because they all became known as orchestrators, and we need to make it accessible for people. But then after a certain amount of time, they all started to sort of diverge, and they diverged because of what they're, why they were there individually, right? So CloudStack, you summed it up perfectly, was a Bay Area startup. They set out to solve this problem for service providers and enterprises very, very specifically. VMware vCloud Director really set out in a way and you'll probably disagree with me on this, but set out as a way as VMware protecting their hypervisor business, right? And making sure that people weren't going and using other people's orchestration.
There was absolute lock-in mentality with that one, right? It was never going to do any other hypervisor.
They were giving vCloud Director away free, right? OpenStack set out predominantly, I mean, okay, we all know the original origins in terms of NASA and everything, but once a lot of vendors got involved, it was there to counter that threat from VMware and to try and push everybody towards another hypervisor. And, you know, what was driving those projects is, you know, has then dictated where they've gone and where they've become. OpenStack has become this huge software foundation with, I don't know how many now, 40 odd different projects covering everything from block storage to containers to, you know, everything. vCloud Director continues to be roughly the thing you described. But CloudStack sort of quietly, and I say quietly because it was always the quiet child of that group, has just continued to solve those problems. And people who get drawn to CloudStack come because they don't want to sit next to a vendor roadmap and, you know, if things change. They want hypervisor independence. That's,
yeah,
you know,
agnosticity. Yeah, agnosticity.
Exactly.
So before we go on, let's put elephant in the room, because I think a lot of people think this is one and the same. So OpenStack versus CloudStack, just knock it on the head.
All right. Okay. So you could look at this initially and say this was the analyst community and the commentator community. I suppose I'd include you in that. If you've been doing this 8 years ago, liked a 2-horse race, right? They wanted to see.
We love a 2-horse race.
Yeah, because it gives us something to bet on and something to talk about and what have you. But again, go back to that point I'm making in terms of the, you know, the initial objectives of OpenStack as a thing was to reinvent private infrastructure as the cloud. It was hugely ambitious, hence the 40 projects. CloudStack was this quiet orchestrator used overwhelmingly back then by service providers, although that's going to change. It's a product, you install it, you connect it to some hypervisors, you connect it to some networking, and off it goes. Okay, yeah. It's the unglamorous end, and it's never had the massive aspirations that something like OpenStack's had. Roll forward now, you just can't compare now, because OpenStack is effectively a new software foundation with lots and lots of different projects. CloudStack is one project in the Apache software foundation. Yeah.
And I think, you know, for the longest time there, I mean, I remember my various bosses coming to me, being the lead architect and the guy that was dictating the direction of platforms. They would come to me and say, "Oh, what's this OpenStack, and when are we going to move to it?" And, you know, I hear that it's going to be the next big thing, and it's going to be bigger than vCloud Director, and it's going to knock off VMware. And, you know, people basically, from my perspective, saw OpenStack as a hypervisor itself, when really, like you said, that's not what it was about at all. You know what I mean? But that's where people saw it. They saw it as OpenStack, hypervisor, it's lost, and now it's basically in the corner. Whereas from what I've kept track with, you know, things like, and CloudStack, you got Open Nebula, all these other things that were kind of simmering back then, they're still around and still doing some really cool things. Yeah. But I'm just thinking back, and it wasn't always the case. And we talked about this before, and I just wanted to raise it. I remember going through elements of pain when I was testing CloudStack to start with. You know, it was fairly buggy. There were some things that were just weird with it. And ultimately, because of our because of the VMware dominance and our personal perspective, we went down the vCloud Director path. That was us. Now, I was aware of another company that was in Australia that we were kind of competing with. They launched a fully rebranded subsidiary based on CloudStack, and they were the poster boys of the infrastructure service, the next Amazon EC2 killer in the country. But what I remember, what lived in infamy for them was basically a fairly significant outage they had it on Zen, and it was CloudStack, and basically for 2 whole weeks, no VM could be stopped or started from a position where they had an incident, and it basically just killed them. So that was a bit of a hit, I felt, for CloudStack at the time, because it got some really bad press. And I think also around the 2013 mark, that's when it was handed over to the Apache Foundation, right? Basically, it was, I'm not sure if it was an acquisition. I'm not sure how that worked exactly, but maybe just talk about those times, because obviously there were some challenges around those times, and you guys were obviously deep in it.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? We were about that time frame. We were an emerging system integrator who had to build things because our customers were coming to us with very real requirements, right? They weren't science projects our customers were doing. We were winning tenders to build nation state clouds, to build large organizations clouds and that sort of thing. And there's no denying that was the very early days of CloudStack, which was a technology that had been put together in 18 months, 2 years or something until that time frame. And it did have challenges and it had problems, right? There's another couple of factors there, and I don't know the details of the people you're talking about, but one of the reasons, if not the reason, I started ShapeBlue was because the lack of knowledge I saw and awareness of the new way of thinking about scale and reliability, etc., etc. And what we did, we started as a company to fix that problem. But I do know of a lot of organizations who said, look, hold on, we've been doing this for years, guys, right? We know how to run data centers. We're just going to install this orchestrator and off we go. So there may have been a bit of that in play at the time.
Yeah.
But then the other thing that was interesting, you touched on it there about the Apache Software Foundation. So the bit of CloudStack's history I didn't mention before, it was this Bay Area startup, and they got acquired really early by Citrix, a major US vendor. And, that was a huge strategic acquisition for them. It was just as this gold rush was happening, OpenStack was popping up as potentially the future of the world. And Citrix said, hey, we can buy this great technology and we can have that, we can own that future of the world. And seemed like a great move. They didn't execute that at all well. They were around for about 2 years. And we actually worked with Citrix. It was actually a Citrix technology when ShapeBlue was first.
I'm pretty sure it was Citrix, obviously, when it was cloud.com, but it was still, Citrix when I was working with it as well. Yeah.
And you've got a hugely complicated bit of software that's orchestrating at quite a deep level hypervisors and infrastructure. Anything, not just CloudStack, any of these technologies needs a lot of expertise around it, right?
Yeah.
It needs solid support. It needs all the things that we now do as a company, focusing just on that one thing. But go back to that time frame, Citrix were trying to apply, huge scalability to their sales figures on it, probably got ahead of themselves in terms of technical capability. And one of the things we did do, one of the things on our evolution here at ShapeBlue was that I think it was about 2014, we launched our own support services, which now constitute most of our revenue as a company. And at the time, Citrix really weren't happy with us doing that because they had a commercial distribution, and we were saying, no, you can take the open source and we'll support you. But we did that as a reaction to how badly things were going with them as a vendor, in terms of, the people you're talking about there were probably working with them at the time.
Yeah, so you're right. So there's a big skills gap, especially when things go wrong. I mean, in any technology that we're talking about at this level, when something goes wrong, when you're putting your trust at a control plane level, only something small has to go wrong to basically make it all fall apart, right? And in those early days, it was a bit of a house of cards sort of scenario. And to be fair, I mean, you've got to look at all the cloud management platforms around that time, and I know, like, from a point of view of vCloud Director, I mean, the amount of bugs that VMware have actually fixed within that and have sorted to over the past 10, 12 years, it's in the millions, right? So it's a very complex piece of control plane that's doing these things. And it's also such a critical piece of control plane software as well, because you're basically giving the keys to your own infrastructure, or a chunk of that infrastructure, to a tenant to do whatever they want through it effectively.
Yeah.
And there's great power in that. But also that then has the ability to then, if there's a bug that impacts other tenants, that's always been the biggest problem in any multi-tenant cloud, right? Like, if one particular customer becomes noisy and impacts the next door neighbor, that's a problem. But in this way, when you put in a control plane, a bug could potentially lead to serious downtime or loss of system as well. So, it's not an easy thing.
One thing you touched on at the end there is about the process of it becoming an Apache project, right? So that that happened back in 2013, and I think Citrix had got themselves overwhelmed, and they said, okay, we need some external help with this thing. So they took CloudStack, lock, stock, and barrel, and donated it to the Apache Software Foundation.
Just straight donation.
Straight donation. intellectual property, code base, obviously, the trademarks, the lots. And they then did their own fork on top for a number of years, which wasn't hugely successful. But the idea of their donation there was that they could let in the people who were using the software to start to make more direct contributions. Okay. And that side of things was hugely successful. And quite quickly, CloudStack became a user-driven community, right? So the people who were contributing to CloudStack were people from organizations like Apple, for example, who are running a very large CloudStack environment. They were contributing directly to the project, as other organizations were. And that continues to this day. That brought around a lot of stability very, very quickly, because with an orchestrator, you think of the test matrix you're going to have to run, Anthony. You think of the infinite number of pieces of infrastructure underneath and their infinite number of configurations. Getting test coverage on something like that for any vendor is almost impossible, right? Yeah. Even with people like VMware, it's almost impossible. You've got to get it out in the field, and there's no better way of doing that than having the people who are running it in production also able to test it and also able to contribute patches.
You've hit a very good point there, right? About end user testing, edge cases, and service providers are the ones that usually push the stable in terms of these edge users. Any software vendor is kind of scared to give their bit of software to a service provider because they know they're going to do something funky, something different with it. So you've actually made a really good point. I never really thought of it that way, that when you've got a community-driven project that's being, contributed by the actual guys that are testing it in these weird ways, that's going to create a better product. And I kind of think about Kubernetes in that way a little bit as well. And I'm kind of putting two and two together there and thinking how that's become fairly successful as well. And it's probably driven through the same things. And we'll touch on containers a little bit later on in Kubernetes. But
you're right. I mean, that you've hit one of the major benefits of open source, right? You're going to get test coverage and edge cases more than and more direct feedback in that. It's not getting washed through a vendor, engagement model and what have you. And the other thing with that is, I talk about CloudStack being a very user-driven community. Not all communities are. I mean, some communities, especially when they're really, really, really at the top of the hype cycle, suck in vendors left, right, and center, because vendors all want to use that as their go-to market. And you can end up with communities which are a little bit heavy with vendors and a bit light on the users of the software. Something like Kubernetes, they've got a nice balance there, right? But other projects haven't always had that.
Yeah. So around 2015, so that's when you started, you became one of the biggest contributors to that Apache CloudStack project, or foundation. So just talk a little bit how you guys became one of the biggest contributors to the actual project itself. That's really interesting. So not only working with it, but it also means that you've hired some really smart people in that space to be able to do that and to actually contribute.
Yeah. Okay. So I suppose the first thing to say is to actually sort of almost correct the question you're asking me there, right? Which is, one of the things with Apache and the Apache Software Foundation is that organizations don't contribute. Right. Individuals contribute as volunteers. And that's one of the key things of Apache's governance model, which is different to many other foundations. Right. Because with that at the heart of it, what it means is you don't get corporate patronage, right? You can't buy a seat at the table with the ASF. So decisions are made by the community, by a set of people voting in the community. As an organization, I can't buy votes. I can't influence technical direction more than the other person who's working for some other company that has only been in the community 5 minutes, right? But we've always done some analysis in terms of what our team here at ShapeBlue is contributing. And it's pretty crude, to be frank. We look at number of commits, we look at lines of code written, that sort of thing. And we saw this curve, as Citrix were paying less and less attention. They were always the dominant vendor in CloudStack. And, we've got some big user contributors, but users aren't going to be doing the core common stuff, right? They tend to work on stuff that affects them and interests them. Yeah. And as we were emerging as a services company that were 100% by this stage working with CloudStack, I sort of woke up one day and went, oh no, we're the dominant vendor in this community. And I use those words really lightly because I hate it when people use that. In fact, I don't know if I should have said that.
Yeah.
But, you know, and we actually see a lot of responsibility with that as well. And we've gone to great lengths as a company, and this isn't always easy at all, is in that we don't try and influence our individual contributors, which is, to be frank, nearly everybody in this organization. I have a rule, which is the company will never overrule their decision when they're representing themselves in the community. And we have to internally as a company reach consensus on things and make sure we're all agreed on things, which has actually then had an impact on our management hierarchy. We have a very, very flat structure here, and that's to reflect that model that we have these people who are in power. Because, you know, we've got a software engineer here who works in a team for somebody who then works for somebody else who then works for me. That person is a committer in the Apache CloudStack project and has the same rights in that project as I do. And we as a company have really gone to great lengths that we don't try and, you know, hurdle our sheep to be doing the same thing. And that's not always easy, right? We obviously have objectives as a company and things we're trying to do for our customers, but we have to keep the balance there, making sure we're acting like good citizens in that community at all times.
Yeah. So just, you know, and again, this is, you know, we've purposely gone and talking about CloudStack here. This is the first, and that's a great technology we're talking about in this particular episode. But in terms of ShapeBlue, just before we get into some of the questions as to, you know, the success that you guys have had the last couple of years and the emergence or the re-emergence and the popularity of CloudStack in the industry. So you guys are spread across 9 countries from memory. And, you know, you're in terms of your customer base, you know, where do they sit? Are they mostly, I mean, obviously, I believe they're going to be mostly service providers, but are you seeing them differentiate of late, or what can you say about that?
Yeah. Okay. So some stats. Yeah. I mean, we've got people in 9 different countries. We have offices in 5 different countries. And I'll openly say we used to have offices in 5 different countries. They're still there, but nobody's been in them, certainly for the last 12 months, apart from a very occasional meeting. So we're really distributed as a company. Our customers are as well, right? I mean, our customers are in 19 different countries.
Right, okay.
So we haven't gone again, very similar to the thing I was talking about in terms of how we handle our open source work. We haven't gone the sort of command and control route in terms of our geographic layout. What we do is very specialist. We only really are interested in working with the customer if it's around Apache CloudStack. That's all we do. Huge range of technical skills to support that, because we go and build cloud environments, but we've never been tempted to, you know, go and also become specialists in this storage platform and that platform. We have a lot of skills in those things. We have to, but our entire message is around we're the CloudStack people.
I was going to say, how do you put those two together? Because obviously, you know, you have to sort of draw a line somewhere. But you know, your guys obviously have some understanding of networking, storage, compute, and how it all comes. You have to, right? But then there's obviously, because by nature of this control plane, by nature of the fact that CloudStack is agnostic and can run across multiple hypervisors, you have to have a breadth of knowledge. So how do you sort of balance that out?
Yeah, we've got a lot of that knowledge. We've got people who contribute to Ceph. We've got people who contribute to KVM. We've got some hugely deep networking experience here. We have to have that. So don't read into it that we haven't got all of that. The thing is, what we don't do as a company is go to market with any of that, right?
I understand.
We could realistically, there's probably a dozen or so technologies we could launch some services around in terms of the experience we've got here. But after years of running a managed service provider, it's like the ability to focus on one thing and do it really well is
maniacal. Maniacal, narrow focus. That's the way. And it's clearly you've been successful for that, you know, over the past sort of 10 years or so. So let's talk a little bit about, you know, what you're seeing today, you know, some of the industry trends, because I've kind of got the feel from talking around the space, the service provider space, over the past sort of 12 months and more recently 6 months, that there's a little bit of a groundswell to move away from VMware as a hypervisor. And I think I've seen that reflected in a couple of discussions that I've had. But where do you see that? And has that obviously meant that CloudStack is taking some sort of reinvigorated prominence for yourself? And are they actually looking at CloudStack as well as moving the underlying hypervisor, or is it more let's look at CloudStack, let's keep VMware, and let's add maybe a KVM, or let's do that?
There's a bit of a backstory to that. First of all, this isn't just the service provider space, right? So I think you asked this in a previous question, I didn't answer it. Nowadays we're roughly 50-50.
50-50.
Our two verticals as a company are service provider and everybody else, right? Enterprise, the industry would traditionally call it. And we work with people like, I mentioned before, Apple, SAP, those sort of people who are running effectively what we would call private cloud.
Private cloud, It's not a surprise.
Although I'd love to go back to calling it data center automation, which is what I called it when I first got involved. It would be simpler sometimes. There is definitely a movement away from VMware. People are often surprised, in the service provider space, VMware is there a lot, right? It's not all just about cost in the service provider space. There is definitely a movement from VMware. I'd say the biggest recipient of that is KVM, although, we've seen a really cool project recently, XCP-ng, which is a fork of Zen server. And that's starting to get some really good traction at the moment. And that predominantly is around, cost decisions, right? People feel they're being squeezed by VMware. On the counter to that, they've got a lot of skills. It is a great hypervisor technology, full featured, a lot of tooling around it. One of the things CloudStack has always given is that hypervisor agnostic, right? So which basically means we support a whole range of hypervisors. We support vSphere, KVM, Zen, XCP-ng, OVM, Hyper-V, and a few more as well. Now, what we're seeing is some people, particularly on the enterprise space, are actually implementing CloudStack deliberately as an abstraction layer to give them more flexibility with their hypervisor underneath. I mean, it's always been one of the things in the service provider space. Great thing about CloudStack, you put it at the front, the API looks the same. Your consumers don't know what hypervisor you're running on unless you want to tell them, right? But people are now using that in the enterprise because what CloudStack is effectively giving them is a common API, UI, and a CLI for their consumers internally to access their infrastructure.
It's all about consumption. It's all about the way it's consumed.
Correct. Now, that infrastructure may be built on a particular type of hypervisor. Now, if they start automating and giving APIs out which are hard coded to, say, VMware, they're locked in, they're stuck. And that's one of the things that CloudStack gives is the ability to mix them out. And literally you have environments with all of those hypervisors I mentioned running at the same time. I mean, probably a little bit elaborate. So we're actually seeing a use case, which is we want to implement CloudStack to allow us to start to move hypervisors. And there is definitely a trend in that direction. 5 years ago, VMware was, the bulletproof hypervisor. Others fell quite a long way short. They're catching up, right? And VMware have gone the route of tooling, right? Of tooling.
The ecosystem around the hypervisor.
Correct. And, that works for a lot of organizations. A lot of organizations don't need that tooling, right? So we're definitely seeing that trend, and we're seeing that with existing customers as well, moving workloads because everybody's trying to save costs in that cloud service provider space.
So people are trying to save costs on one end, but they want a consumption that is equal to what they would get in a public cloud, and that's where the Amazons of the world and the Azures and I think as well to a certain extent the reason why people are maybe shift and say KVM is because Hyper-V is kind of like disappeared a little bit to a certain extent. The void, obviously Microsoft are going, Azure is where it is. Hyper-V is still there. Do we care if you use it? Maybe not, because we want everyone to go into Azure or the Azure stack or whatever it might be, the other stack that we haven't talked about. So that's where I think KVM, Red Hat's obviously renewed. It's reinvigorated to basically push Red Hat virtualization, but then all the flavors of KVM. However, also there's this thing, that's been bubbling as well from the point of view of containerization and Kubernetes, which I think has helped with that shift about how we consume the compute layer, and then to that end, how we then develop applications. So to a certain extent, it becomes, again, I've talked about this a lot, a developer-led decision to a certain point,
Exactly.
because they're dictating how they develop the apps. Where are they developing them? Well, they're developing on these, more open source type of platforms. What is that going to lead to? What are we trying to actually host? Then when they become a production-like application, we need somewhere to host them. So I think there's this push towards that, which can be, not only pulled from the cost implications of VMware, but also the way that developers are starting to, really dictate the application development world.
Yeah, I agree.
So let's just talk about Kubernetes a little bit, because I noticed that one of the big things that's in one of the latest releases was, I think it was called container services before, but then CloudStack basically took the gambit and said, look, it's Kubernetes. They've kind of won. Again, 2-horse races, whatever it might be. We love that. Kubernetes has clearly come out on top. So CloudStack's basically turned it into the Kubernetes section of. Can you just talk a little bit about how that's being implemented and where you're seeing that put into play, and if you're doing a lot of work around that as well?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, start at the beginning. There's a lot of organizations who are running Kubernetes on top of CloudStack. A lot of our customers, a lot of other people we know. And they're not necessarily doing it with the CloudStack Kubernetes service that you talk about. It's just another layer in their stack. They've got CloudStack sitting at the virtual layer and still consuming their APIs. And then they've got effectively Kubernetes workloads sat on top of that virtual layer, and their developers are doing whatever they want. And that's happened for some time. What the CloudStack Kubernetes service is about is primarily around making that easy, right? And people not having to stick it together with sticky tape and plaster. So yeah. It's an add-in to, a plug-in to Apache CloudStack. And what it basically does, it creates a concept in Apache CloudStack of a Kubernetes cluster and automates the deployment of Kubernetes in your data center. So It doesn't do anything inside of that. You're still going to use whatever tool in kubectl or whatever it is for actually managing your containers. But we're thinking that CloudStack is sitting at a layer below Kubernetes, is the infrastructure piece. So when the app team say, okay, we need a Kubernetes environment, they can either go and deploy it onto a lot of either physical or virtual infrastructure by hand, or they can use the container service, which is going to automate that deployment.
Okay, so this Kubernetes service in CloudStack doesn't necessarily take that second step where it goes, let's now deploy a pod, let's deploy a namespace, let's deploy apps. It's really all about the actual Kubernetes cluster deployment.
Exactly. But here's the interesting bit. There is, as part of that, there is a Kubernetes CloudStack provider, which basically lets CloudStack react to events coming up out of the pods and clusters in Kubernetes. So with that, we've got things like auto scaling, right? So when Kubernetes said it needs more nodes, CloudStack is going to go and create more nodes for them. And actually, you can use that provider without the container service itself. We have people who are using that outside of it. And then the final bit, because if you remember, there's 50% of the people who are using CloudStack are service providers, is then the whole billing and metering piece around the edge. Because if you're a service provider, you're going to use this tool to deliver not container as a service, you're going to use it to deliver Kubernetes as a service. Okay. And just like, say, Google do, for example, effectively what people are paying for is the underlying virtual infrastructure underneath their Kubernetes nodes. And that's the model we've gone with CloudStack. We've got a number of service providers who have literally lifted that out of the box and gone to market with a, Kubernetes as a service offering.
That's interesting, actually, because I think what you've hit there is the two pain points of Kubernetes in general is, getting a consistent deployment that works, that you can do it one time the whole time with a level of consistency. And then multi-tenancy in that level, this kind of solves that. But then billing is so important. And I guess the one thing we haven't touched on with CloudStack is the billing element. Obviously, it's quite strong in that. And that's a big piece of why I would say it's popular, because billing is difficult in this world. And if something can simplify the billing aspect of it, then you're halfway there to selling it as a service.
Yeah. And, we touched on earlier the idea of, the infinite number of permutations of infrastructure underneath. Is like, billing's where it gets really complicated. The infinite number of different ways that people want to bill and meter their usage and different tax rates and stuff like that. Now, CloudStack's got, a lot of functionality around this, but CloudStack sees itself as effectively a data producer, right? It doesn't calculate the tax rates for you. CloudStack actually doesn't have a dollar or a pound or a yen concept, right? What CloudStack does is produce usage data. That can be retrieved, in JSON, XML through the API. It can be pulled out of data.
Put through something.
Yeah, and then we've got a whole range of integrations with different things. People push it out into their billing systems. You think, some of the large organizations who are billing based on CloudStack, they don't want their own another new billing engine. They just want some product usage information to be pushed through into their main billing calculator.
There's some data, suck it out, put it through something, and let's see what it washes up with.
Correct.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Let's finish off almost where we started, which was when we talked about UI, console, all that kind of stuff, right? So, the CloudStack console and the UI to start with, back when I was using it, was awesome. It looked amazing, looked futuristic, it looked modern, right? That was 2010, 2011. I guess one of the biggest things that I've seen come out of the notes over the last couple of releases, and there's like LCS releases every 6 months or so for this.
Yeah, roughly, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So there's been like a new UI which has refreshed it to bring it up to a more modern look, right? So how important? We obviously in these situations with these control planes, obviously we understand that automation, APIs, and other sort of ways to interact with it. I believe there's even its own command line at the moment that you can use. But the UI is still very important, right? Because that's what the tenants want to use primarily. So just talk maybe through what's so good about this new UI, and how we're balancing the old and new, and how it's going to be phased out.
Yeah, I think the problem we had until about a year ago with the CloudStack UI is the existing one was so good, right? It was so good and so widely adopted. And the idea, when CloudStack was designed as an orchestrator, the idea is that the big users wouldn't use the built-in GUI. They would bolt their own GUI on top. And, and a number still do that. But there was this really good, rich control panel, and it became so standard, if you like, with the people who are using it, who then are then exposing it to their customers, who are then doing documentation and training around it. So the initiative to create a new UI was quite a hard one to get off the ground, right? Because everybody's like, no, we like this, but it became increasingly dated and difficult to manage. And there was so much development going on in CloudStack. It got to the crazy situation where, some big technical features, like 50% of the effort was going into the UI. So this project was started as an R&D project, and the idea was to bring it into one of the 21st century frameworks. We used React.js, I think, eventually, and that was mainly about making it easy to maintain, speed of development, but also having a UI which looked like it was from the 21st century. Right? The old one is highly usable. I mean, it's now been deprecated. It's not there. So we talk about the new UI. It's now the UI. But one that was pretty consistent with other infrastructure management tools.
It was standard. It was what you'd expect.
Correct. Yeah, correct. The old one looked completely different and was really good, but it just wasn't standard. So yeah, that's been in since CloudStack, I think 2.14, where the new UI came out. The next release, it got switched to become no longer the new UI, the actual UI.
The UI.
And we're now deprecating the old one. But as I say, a lot of organizations, I'm a big believer in UIs. It presents what your software looks like, it's polished, etc.
Yeah.
But you've got to remember, with something like CloudStack, probably 90% of the interaction with an orchestrator like CloudStack is through its API, right? Yeah. People are automating their building whole environments, they're tearing them down, they're deploying stuff, and they're doing that through tooling and scripting at the front. They're not doing it through a UI. But I absolutely agree with you. You know, it's got to look good.
Yeah, I mean, look, infrastructure as code is well, it's not the future. It is today, right? It's what people are doing, right? And you have to have those sort of providers out there to do it. Oh man, the time runs through. I told you this was going to take. We were going to rush through the time here. So let me just. I usually ask a bunch of questions, but I think I just want to ask one last question. Is, you know, what's the future of ShapeBlue? You know, how are you looking to continue to disrupt the market that you clearly went in? You saw an addressable market. You grabbed that market. So what's the future hold?
Okay, so it's the second time today, Anthony. I've almost sort of answered your question by correcting the question. It's like, we don't want to disrupt the market, right? I know you have a lot of guys on here who are doing brand new stuff, but CloudStack is in its plateau of productivity, right? It's constantly evolving, and it's got a hugely long tail in terms of the value it's bringing to organizations. So ours is more evolution than revolution. We're not disrupting the market. We want to be boring. We want to just be the plumbing that people rely on, right? And think of other technologies like this. Another Apache technology like web server, for example. Now, not many people commercialize around that, but that technology has been around for what, 20 something years. It's still driving a good percentage of the world's websites, and as equally important and delivering as much value as it was in the first time, and it's still evolving slowly. So, you know, we're not going to change the world here at ShapeBlue or with CloudStack, but what we want to do is be, you know, increasingly reliable. We have a relatively limited scope, and we don't want that scope to explode. So what we work with is more and more vendors who are integrating with us, and us just to be seen as like effectively the go-to IaaS orchestration piece. And actually now all virtualized stuff is basically in the plateau of productivity. So is VMware, right? So is KVM. We're all there, right? None of these things are new. It's all just about delivering long-term value and stability to those customers, and that's what we're going to continue to do. Great
answer. And to be honest with you, you're not the first one to answer that by saying that we don't want to disrupt. So you're not alone there, and you articulated the reason for that perfectly, right? But suffice to say, you've seen something, you've seen a great piece of technology, and you've built something special around it, and you're actually contributing to that as well. So, you know, and I guess the fruits of those labors are the guys that you help, and they actually are producing, you know, and offering services built on your own solutions that you've helped them put into play. And that in turn helps companies grow, move, and be profitable. So there's all sorts of great stuff that you're doing there. So you're contributing in a great amount of ways there. So thank you very much for being on the show. I love these discussions around cloud and service provider technologies, the control panels. It's kind of, you know, again, I lived through this. I live vicariously these days through it because I'm somewhat off the tools. So it's great to talk to guys that are in and around it. And, you know, it's good to have that chat. So just to wrap up, once again, if you aren't subscribed or if you're new to the show, you'd like to hear more, you can subscribe to the podcast, again, all through Anchor, or subscribe to the YouTube button just below. And with that, thank you to Giles, thank you to ShapeBlue, and we'll see you again next time on Great Things with Great Technology. Thank you.
Does that work?
Awesome.
Good. Does that work?
Beautiful. Yeah.